change is a really important issue that our nation is facing in terms of environment and energy policy. So currently the federal, you're videotaping, feel free to ask questions as I go through this too. Well, currently the federal government is trying to come up with a plan to address greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases are known to contribute to climate change, which means causing patterns and changes in the weather patterns. So the biggest contributor, the biggest greenhouse gas that the federal government is trying to control is something called carbon dioxide, also known as CO2. And this is a result of the combustion of fossil fuels. So for example, this would affect different industries, the transportation sector, as well as coal-fired power plants. So today I'm going to just give you some background about how we generate electricity, as well as a little bit of information about Ameren, followed by what type of legislation is being proposed, as well as what we mean by cap and trade legislation, and finally the potential impact that this might have on us as customers. So like I mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go through this. So this first slide, well, first of all, let me give you a little bit of background about Ameren. At Ameren, we recently went through some name changes. Since we have companies in Missouri and companies in Illinois, so effective October 1st, we decided to call the companies in Missouri, Ameren, Missouri, and in Illinois, Ameren, Illinois. And I work for Ameren Services, which provides support to both of the companies. So the reason why we went through this name change is because different states, we have different regulations and rules that we comply by. So to make it easier, we decided to make some changes. So as far as how we generate electricity at Ameren, most of the electricity is generated from coal-fired power plants. And this pie chart shows a breakdown of the generation mix in our state. Over 70% is from coal-fired power plants. We also have some from natural gas, hydroelectricity, and nuclear. So with the coal, we're creating a lot of greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. And so this is what the government is trying to target, to try to control the emissions from the coal-fired power plants.
Where's the nuclear plant?
Oh, in Missouri. So what this represents is a generation mix in general for our area. So currently there are some legislation efforts that have been proposed, and actually in the House of Representatives last year, one bill actually was passed that deals with greenhouse gases, and this is called the Waxman-Markey bill. And it was narrowly passed in the House, and it deals with cap and trade. So in order for a bill to become a law, it needs to pass in both the House and the Senate, and nothing made it to the Senate. So if in the legislation efforts that are being proposed, they deal with long-term changes, like that go out to 2050. And so if Congress doesn't enact some legislation, then the United States Environmental Protection Agency has authority under the Clean Air Act to impose some regulations to try to reduce greenhouse gases. So currently there are a lot of legislation that's being proposed, but the U.S. EPA, it is very likely that they'll try to take some action, because it's unlikely that Congress will pass something. And the reason why the U.S. EPA will probably propose some regulations is because this is a very important issue to President Obama. It's one of his big initiatives. So if the U.S. EPA does impose regulations, this will be like immediate, and it'll be very costly. So before I'm going to spend some time talking about cap and trade, and before I go into the details, there's some basic definitions that'll be helpful. This is a complex issue, so cap and trade, I'll do the best that I can to try to explain what it means, but just to give you like an overall picture of what it means, it's a way that the government is trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time. So early on, they'll set certain standards that each company can emit so many tons of carbon dioxide, but over time, they'll reduce the amount that companies can emit. And so companies will be issued something called an allowance, which is like a permit and a right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So that's what an allowance is. And an offset, that's something that a company can do to try to reduce or sequester their greenhouse gases. It's an action that they can take. Like, for example, a company could, create a forest, plant a lot of trees that'll absorb the CO2, or try to encourage no-till farming, agriculture, things like that. But in order for an allowance to, for a company to receive an allowance, there are two forms that this might occur, and it'll happen either in the form of an allocation or through an auction. And in an allocation, the government would issue these allowances for free. So, and the amount of allowances would be based on a variety of factors, historic factors. But if these allowances are auctioned off, then the companies would have to pay for each allowance, and this would cost quite a bit of money. So, I'm going to try to explain what cap and trade means through like a musical chairs type of analogy. So in our example here, we're saying that like each chair represents an allowance or a right to pollute 1 metric ton of CO2. And so it's really hard to understand what carbon dioxide is because you don't really see it, but this is like a common unit of measurement that we use in the industry. So if you have a chair, then you get like an allowance. You have the right to emit 1 ton of CO2.
Over what period of time?
Well, maybe early on you'll get a whole bunch, but as time goes on, then you'll be limited by how many you have. So this legislation, it would probably start in 2013, and it would go to 2050. So I have some graphs that'll show you what we're talking about. So the purpose of the game is to reduce the greenhouse emissions. Also, we'll say in our analogy, to reduce the number of seats. So the game authority or the government would have the right to limit the number of permits over time. So they'll set certain targets over time to try to encourage the reduction in CO2 emissions. So this cap is imposed by limiting the amount of chairs. So the players or the different companies would have to compete for the right to emit. So in our analogy, we'll say that one player doesn't have a chair. So this player wants to continue to produce electricity, but if they don't have a chair, then they have a dilemma. How will they continue to produce electricity? So either they can trade, either they can work with another company that maybe has extra allowances and offer them a certain amount of money to try to buy an allowance, or they can try to take some sort of action to try to reduce their emissions. And when I say an action, they can either install equipment to try to reduce their CO2 emissions or something. So this player has a dilemma, and he has to determine how much it's going to cost. Is it cheaper for him to work with another utility that has extra allowances, or should he go ahead and pay millions of dollars to try to install some equipment? So in this example, we'll say that through the market, they come up with a plan of how much it'll cost for an allowance. So they maybe will set the market at $30 per ton. So as the chairs are eliminated over time, the cost will likely increase for these allowances too.
How much is just for understanding, how much is a 1 metric?
For like in terms of pounds, it's like over 2,200 pounds. Also, it's equivalent to like 1 megawatt hour. Each time we generate 1 megawatt hour, it's like 1 metric ton. So Ameren as a company, we produce over 70 million tons per year. So that's a lot.